He had not spoken in 4 years. Not one word. Not to the speech therapist who came 3 times a week for the first 2 years. Not to the neurologist who visited quarterly and asked the same careful questions in a slightly louder voice each time, as if volume were the variable that had been preventing communication. Not to the chaplain who came on Sundays and sat with him and prayed aloud and occasionally paused to give the silence a chance to fill with something, and which the silence declined to do. Not to his daughter, who came every other Sunday from the 43rd floor of a building on Michigan Avenue and sat across from him in the visitor's room with the specific posture of a person who has not given up, but has reorganized what giving up means so that it no longer looks like giving up from the outside. He had not spoken in 4 years. And then on a Wednesday night in November he spoke to me, not in the way people usually speak, not with his voice which the stroke had taken and not returned, but in the way I had learned to receive speech from my own father 15 years before, in a different room in a different city, on the other side of a loss that had seemed at the time like it would unmake me entirely. He spoke with his hands, and with his eyes, and with the particular quality of his attention when he understood that someone in the room was actually trying to understand him rather than trying to manage him, which are 2 entirely different things, and which a person who cannot speak learns to distinguish between in the first week of not speaking. I understood him. He knew I understood him. And what he told me that night in 20 minutes of careful, effortful, incomplete but entirely legible communication was the thing he had been trying to say for 4 years to a room full of people who did not know how to receive it. My name is Joseph Briggs. I am 52 years old. I work the overnight shift at Lakeview Gardens Memory and Rehabilitation Center in Evanston, Illinois. I am a certified nursing assistant, which means I help people with the things their bodies can no longer do reliably on their own. And I have been doing this work for 11 years. And I want to tell you something about it before I tell you anything else. This work is invisible in the specific way that all care work is invisible, which is that it only becomes visible when it fails. Nobody writes a story about the night aide who turned a patient at 2 in the morning and prevented a pressure sore. Nobody writes about the hand held during a night terror or the glass of water brought without being asked, because the pattern of a person's restlessness has become familiar enough to read. The work happens and then it is over, and the person in the bed is more comfortable than they were, and the aide goes to the next room and does it again. That is the whole of it. That is what 11 years of overnight shifts looks like from the outside, which is to say it looks like nothing at all. I am a single father. My son Derek is 24 years old. He lives in Milwaukee and works for a nonprofit that does housing advocacy, and he is, without exaggeration, the best person I know. His mother and I divorced when Derek was 7. It was not a dramatic divorce. We had married young and had grown in directions that did not overlap, and we were honest about it early enough that the ending was sad rather than catastrophic. She is a good woman and a good mother, and Derek has never suffered for the separation, because we made certain he would not, which required a degree of sustained maturity from 2 people in their early 30s that I am still quietly proud of. After the divorce it was me and Derek was enough, and the years of it shaped me in the ways that the years of raising a child alone always shape you, which is to say they made me patient and attentive, and very good at being present in a room with someone who needed something they could not yet name. My father's name was Robert Briggs. He was the most important person in my life for 37 years, and I want to tell you about him in enough detail that when I tell you what the stroke took from him, you understand what was taken, because the stroke is not the story, but the story cannot be understood without it. My father grew up in Bronzeville, the son of a man who worked at the post office and a woman who took in ironing and believed, with a specificity and force that she transmitted to her children through daily example rather than declaration, that education was not a ladder but a door, and that doors required keys, and that words were the keys, and that her children were going to know how to use them. My father knew how to use them. He knew with the precision of a man who had spent 31 years in a classroom watching other people's children, discover that precision was the difference between saying something and saying the thing. He had a vocabulary that was not showy but was always exactly right. The vocabulary of a man who had read everything and retained it, and who believed that the correct word used correctly was a form of respect both for the language and for the person you were speaking to. And then the stroke took every word, all of them, all at once, and left him entirely intact behind the silence. He was 71 years old when he had his stroke. I was 37. Derek was 12. My father had been a man of considerable and specific language his entire life. He was a high school English teacher for 31 years in the South Side of Chicago, a man who had spent 3 decades teaching other people's children to say precisely what they meant and mean precisely what they said, who had a particular intolerance for imprecision and a particular delight in the moment when a student found the exact right word for something they had been circling for weeks. He was also a man who, outside the classroom, said very little. He was not cold. He was not withholding. He simply operated on the understanding that words were valuable and should not be spent carelessly, which meant that the words he did spend landed with a weight that most people's words did not. I grew up in a house where what my father said mattered specifically because he did not say very much, and then the stroke took the words entirely, not gradually, all at once. One evening in September, he was correcting papers at his kitchen table in the house in Bronzeville where I had grown up, and the next morning he was in a hospital bed at Rush Medical Center, and the man who had spent 31 years teaching the precise use of language could not produce a single syllable. He could understand everything. His comprehension was fully intact. The neurologist explained this carefully, and I understood intellectually what it meant, and it took me several more weeks to understand it emotionally, which is to say to understand what it was like to be my father, to have your full mind present and operational, and not one word of it available for output, to understand every question asked of you and be unable to answer it, to have something you need to say and no mechanism left to say it with. I moved him to a facility in Chicago after 3 months of trying to manage his care from my apartment while working and raising Derek. It was the right decision, and it felt like a failure, and I made peace with both of those things simultaneously in the specific way you make peace with decisions that are right and painful at the same time. I visited every week without exception for the first 2 years. I talked to him the way you talk to a person who cannot respond, which is to say you talk, and the silence receives your words, and you learn to read the silence for what it contains, which is more than most people assume. My father's silence was not empty. I want to be clear about that. It was dense with specific things. Frustration, yes, but also humor, patience, occasional boredom. The particular expression he got when he thought someone was being imprecise, which was an expression I had seen 1,000 times across dinner tables and report cards, and was not diminished at all by the absence of the words that had always accompanied it. I learned to read him the way I had always read him, through the face and the eyes and the angle of the body, and what I read told me that my father was entirely present in there, and entirely unable to reach the surface in any way that the people around him knew how to receive. The facility he was in was adequate. It was a place that did what it said it would do, which is to say it kept him safe and kept him comfortable and provided the clinical interventions that his condition required. The speech therapists were competent. The nurses were professional. The aides were, for the most part, kind. But there is a category of need that lies beyond what facility adequacy covers, and my father was living inside that category. He needed someone who could receive him, not interpret him, not manage him, not apply a protocol designed for post-stroke aphasia patients in general. Someone who could receive him specifically, this man, with his specific history and his specific language and his specific things he needed to say. Nobody in that facility had the time to become that person. I understood this, and understanding it did not make it easier, and I visited every week anyway because the alternative was not visiting, and not visiting was not something I was capable of. I visited every week for 4 years. My father died 7 years after his stroke. He died knowing someone had heard him. I am certain of this. I carry it with me every night into every room on my floor. The facility he was in was adequate. The staff was professional. The speech therapists were competent. But nobody in that facility had the time or the training to learn my father's specific language, which was not ASL and was not any formal alternative communication system. It was the language a man invents when the one he had is taken from him, built from gesture and expression, and the things his hands remembered even when his voice did not. And because nobody learned it, nobody heard him. He was present and unheard for 4 years, which is a sentence I can write now without flinching only because I have had 15 years to learn to write it. I did not handle it well in the first years. I handled it the way a son handles watching his father disappear into a silence that nobody around him is trying to enter. I handled it by working, by raising Derek, by visiting and talking and reading aloud and being present in the room even when presence felt insufficient, which it always did. My father died 7 years after his stroke, 3 years after the story I am about to tell you. He died in the night on a Tuesday in March, and he died, I believe, knowing that someone had heard him. That knowledge is not a small thing. It is, in fact, everything. The resident in room 14 at Lakeview Gardens Memory and Rehabilitation Center in Evanston is named Walter Aldrich. He is 78 years old. He had his stroke 4 years ago. His daughter is a woman named Christine Aldrich, 46 years old, the founder and managing director of a private equity firm in Chicago with a reputation for precision and impatience that the financial press has written about in terms that are mostly admiring and occasionally cautious. I know more about Christine than she knows I know, which is the condition of all the overnight staff in facilities like this, because the people who come in the day and see the clean corridor and the professional staff have no reason to imagine that the people who work at 2 in the morning know the architecture of their family from the outside in, from the visits and the absences, and the things left behind after a Sunday afternoon. I know that Christine and her father were close when she was a child, and grew gradually less close in the years of her building the firm and his retirement, not through any specific rupture but through the accumulated weight of 2 people who loved each other and had less and less language for it. I know this because Walter told me. Over 3 years, in the language he invented after the stroke took his words, he told me more about his life than most people tell anyone. I just had to learn to listen. She visits every other Sunday. She arrives at 11 and leaves at 1. She sits across from her father in the visitor's room with a yellow legal pad on the table between them, not because she writes anything on it, but because having it, there seems to give the visits a structure they would not otherwise have, a suggestion of agenda that makes the silences feel less like failure. I have watched these visits from the corridor many times over the 3 years I have been caring for Walter. I have watched Christine lean forward and ask her father questions he cannot answer. I have watched her watch him attempt to communicate and not be able to receive what he is attempting. I have watched her face do the thing that the faces of people who love someone they cannot reach always do, which is arrange itself into a careful expression that is trying to be several incompatible things simultaneously, attentive and composed, and not showing how much this costs. She is not a cold woman. She is a woman who has not been taught the language her father has been speaking for 4 years, and who does not know that there is a language to learn, because everyone around her has been treating her father's silence as an absence rather than a different kind of presence. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say that nobody at Lakeview Gardens has understood Walter, because I am not being critical of the staff, most of whom are competent, and some of whom are genuinely good at this work. What I mean is that understanding Walter requires a specific kind of attention that the structure of professional care does not easily permit. You cannot learn a person's private language in the 7 minutes allotted for morning care. You cannot receive what someone is trying to tell you when you have 4 other residents who also need you before the shift ends. The system is built for efficiency and attention are not enemies, but they pull in different directions. And in a memory and rehabilitation facility at 3 in the morning, the pulling is constant, and most of the staff feel it and do the best they can with what the hours allow. What I had that most of the staff did not have was a reason, built over 4 years of Sunday visits in Chicago, to believe that the effort of learning someone's private language was worth the time it took. That belief was not professional, it was personal. It came from my father. Everything useful I know about this work came from my father. Walter Aldrich is not silent. I want to say this directly because it is the most important thing I know about him, and it is the thing that nobody who has official contact with him has understood. Walter Aldrich communicates constantly. He communicates with the position of his hands on the blanket and with the direction of his gaze, and with the specific quality of his attention when something in the room interests him versus when it does not. He communicates with the 17.5 degrees by which he turns his head toward the door when he hears a particular kind of footstep in the corridor. He communicates with the way his left hand, which retained some voluntary movement after the stroke, moves against the blanket in patterns that are not random and have never been random, and which I began charting in a small notebook 3 months after I started caring for him, because the patterns were too consistent to be accidental. I know these things because I have been caring for Walter on the overnight shift 3 nights a week for 3 years. I know these things because my father taught me. Over 4 years of weekly visits and the specific education of loving someone the world has written off as unreachable, that the absence of speech is not the absence of language. It is the presence of a language that most people have not learned to read. And I had learned to read it. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to understand, on the Wednesday night in November that I am about to describe, what Walter Aldrich had been trying to say for 4 years. It was 2:47 in the morning. I want to tell you about the specific quality of a memory care facility at 2:47 in the morning, because most people have never been in one at that hour, and the hour matters to the story. At 2:47, the corridor on Walter's floor is entirely quiet. The overhead lights are dimmed to their overnight setting. The nurse's station is lit but still. The sounds of the building at that hour are the sounds of breathing and the occasional shift of a body in a bed, and the faint mechanical hum of the HVAC system and nothing else. It is the most honest hour in the building. The performance of the day, the cheerful voices and the activity programs and the visiting family members and the clinical efficiency of the rounds, all of it has stopped. What is left at 2:47 is just the building and the people in it and the night. And the night does not require anything of anyone. The night is the only time in a facility like this when a person who cannot speak might feel, if someone comes into the room with the right quality of presence, that the room is safe enough to try again. It was 2:47 in the morning. I had finished my rounds on the second floor and Walter's light was on, which sometimes happens when he cannot sleep, and I went in. He was sitting up slightly in the bed, more upright than usual, and his left hand was moving against the blanket in the pattern I had come to associate with something specific, which was the pattern he made when he had something he needed to communicate and was waiting for someone who could receive it. I had seen this pattern before. I had seen it and gotten closer and tried to receive it and partially succeeded and partially missed it. The way you partially succeed and partially miss any communication that is happening in a language you are still learning. But on this particular Wednesday night, something was different. He was more deliberate, slower, as if he had decided to try one more time and was going to be very careful about it. I pulled the chair close to the bed. I sat down. I put my notebook on my knee. And I said to him, in the same voice I had used with my father for 4 years, which is to say quietly and without the slight upward inflection people use when they are speaking to someone they expect not to understand, I said, "I'm here, Walter. Take all the time you need." He looked at me. Not the polite and slightly removed look he gave most of the staff. The look he gave when he knew someone was actually present. The look my father used to give me on the Sundays when I got it right. And then he began. It took 40 minutes. It was the slowest conversation I have ever had. It was also the most important one, and I have had some important conversations in 52 years. He used his hand on the blanket. He used his eyes, directing my gaze to specific objects in the room with a precision that told me he had been practicing this, had been building this vocabulary of gestures in the years of not being heard, waiting for the room that would receive them. He used the particular tension of his jaw when I was going in the wrong direction with my interpretation and the particular release of it when I got something right. It was not a fast process. It was not elegant. There were long pauses while I offered interpretations, and he confirmed or corrected them with the tools he had. But at the end of 40 minutes, I understood what Walter Aldrich had been trying to tell his daughter for 4 years. It was not complicated. It was, in fact, very simple. It was the thing that is almost always very simple once you finally receive it. He wanted her to know that he did not blame her for the distance. The specific distance, not geographical but emotional, that had grown between them in the years before his stroke. The years when she had been building the firm and he had been retired, and they had both been busy in the ways that parents and adult children are busy, when they are not paying attention to the fact that time is finite. He had things he had not said in those years. He wanted her to know that the silence between them before the stroke was not her fault and not his fault, and that what he needed from her now was not the yellow legal pad and the structured visits but something simpler. He needed her to know he was still there, and he needed her to stop being afraid of him, because he could see from his bed that she was afraid of his silence, afraid of the man her father had become, afraid of sitting with someone she could not fix, and the fear was the wall, not the stroke. The stroke had taken his words. The fear had taken everything else. I want to tell you what it felt like to receive what Walter was telling me, because I think the feeling is the part of this that matters most, and the part that is hardest to convey in a summary. It felt like standing in a room where someone had been calling your name in a language you did not know was yours until you heard it. It felt like the Sunday afternoons in Chicago when my father would look at me with that specific expression, and I would understand something that I had not understood the week before, that increment of comprehension that accumulates over years into something that eventually deserves to be called knowing. It felt like the thing that all the professional training in the world cannot give you, which is the recognition that the person in front of you is entirely there and entirely reachable, and has been waiting, with a patience that should humble everyone in the building, for the specific combination of attention and willingness and history that would finally allow the message to land. I wrote it down in my notebook, not verbatim because verbatim was not possible, but in substance, in the truest language I could find for what he had communicated. I sat with it for 2 days before I did anything with it. I needed to be certain I had received it correctly, that I had not projected or interpreted beyond what he had actually given me. I went back to him on Thursday night, and I read him what I had written, and I watched his face while I read it, the face of a man who has been waiting 4 years to be heard. And when I finished, he was looking at me with the expression that my father used to get on the Sundays when I got it completely right. And his left hand was still on the blanket, entirely still, the way it only went still when he had nothing left to correct. On Sunday, when Christine Aldrich arrived for her visit, I asked to speak with her briefly before she went in. She looked at me the way executives look at staff who have stepped outside their designated role, which is to say with a politeness that contains a question about boundaries. I told her I had something to share with her about her father that I thought she needed to hear. She sat down. I gave her the notebook. I told her it was not a diagnosis or a clinical assessment. It was a conversation. She read it twice. The second time she read it more slowly, the way you read something the second time when the first time has not fully given you all of it. When she looked up, her face had done the thing that I have seen faces do, when they receive something they have been waiting for without knowing they were waiting for it. She said, "How did you know?" I told her about my father. I told her about the Sunday visits and the 4 years of learning to read a silence that everyone else in his life had accepted as absence. I told her that her father was not absent, that he had never been absent, that he had been speaking the whole time in the only language available to him, and that what he needed most was not another intervention but someone to be in the room with him without being afraid of the room. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked if she could go in. I said of course. She went in. I did not follow. I went to do my other rounds. When I came back past room 14, 40 minutes later, the door was still closed. I did not open it. I went on. Some rooms you do not enter. She came back the following Sunday, without the legal pad. She stayed for 3 hours instead of 2. I do not know what happened in that room, and it is not mine to know. What I know is what I saw when she left, which was a woman walking through the corridor of a memory care facility with a different quality of step than the one she had arrived with, not lighter exactly, but more settled. More like someone who has put something down that they had been carrying at arm's length for a long time. She stopped at the nurse's station. She asked for me. When I came, she said, "I want to thank you." I said there was nothing to thank me for. She said, "My father communicated with you in 40 minutes what 4 years of professional intervention could not get to. There has to be something." I told her what I always tell people who arrive at this moment, which is that the something is not mine to claim. The something belongs to my father, who spent 4 years teaching me that silence is not the same as absence, who received my weekly visits for 4 years and gave me, over those 4 years, a fluency in a language I had not known existed before he needed me to know it. I told her that what I had done in room 14 was not a skill I had learned in a training program. It was a skill I had learned at a bedside in Chicago on Sunday afternoons, and the person who had taught it to me was gone now, and the best use I knew for what he had given me was to bring it into rooms like his and sit down and be quiet and wait for the language to arrive. She was quiet for a moment. She asked me if there was anything she could do. I told her there was one thing. I told her to come back on Tuesday and Wednesday, and not just every other Sunday. Not because Walter needed the visits to be more frequent, though he did, but because the man in that room was still her father and still entirely present, and the time left for being his daughter was not the unlimited thing it had always appeared to be. She nodded. She left. She came back on Tuesday. She has come back every week since. I want to tell you something about what changed in room 14 after Christine stopped bringing the legal pad. I have worked overnight at Lakeview Gardens for 3 years, and I have seen a great many things in the rooms on my floor in the small hours, and most of what I have seen I keep in the private part of my mind where it belongs. But what happened in room 14 over the months after Christine started coming on Tuesdays is not something I am keeping private because I think it deserves to be said. Walter changed. Not dramatically. Not in ways that would show up on a clinical assessment or a quarterly neurological evaluation. In small ways. In the way a person changes when the thing that has been pressing on them lifts, not all the way but enough. He slept better. His left hand was quieter on the blanket, not because he had less to say but because he was being heard. And the difference between those two things, between having less to say and being heard, is the difference between diminishment and rest. Christine changed too. She came in without the legal pad, and she came in without the structured agenda, and she came in without the careful, composed expression that had been managing her fear. And what she came in with instead was just herself, which was what her father had needed all along. I know this because Walter told me, not in words, but in the specific expression he had when she left after a visit, which was the expression my father used to have when I got a Sunday right. The expression of a man who has been reached. I called Derek the night after Christine's first Tuesday visit. He always answers. He answered. I told him about Walter and Christine and the notebook. He was quiet in the way he gets quiet when something is landing in him. Then he said, "Dad, you gave her what you wished someone had given you." I thought about that for a long time after the call ended. My father's stroke. The Sunday visits, the 4 years of learning to read a language nobody had taught me because nobody had needed me to know it yet. The notebook I had started keeping 3 months into caring for Walter because the patterns were too consistent to be accidental. The Wednesday night in November at 2:47 in the morning when I pulled the chair close to the bed and said, "I'm here, Walter. Take all the time you need." Derek was right. I had given Christine what no one had given me, not the specific thing, not a trained professional who knew how to receive my father's language, but the knowledge that the language existed, the permission to believe that the man in the bed was still the man she knew, the possibility that it was not too late to be his daughter in the way she had not known until 40 minutes with a notebook on a Sunday morning that she still could be. Some things you carry for years before you understand what they were for. Some things you learn at a bedside in Chicago and spend 15 years waiting to use. The waiting is not wasted. The waiting is part of the education. And the education, when it finally finds its use, is worth everything it cost. Before you go, I want to ask you one thing, and I mean it as a real question, not a closing line. Is there someone in your life who is speaking and not being heard? Not because they have lost their voice, because the people around them have not learned the language they are using. The language of the person who communicates through what they do rather than what they say. The language of the parent who shows up but cannot explain why showing up matters. The language of the old man who can no longer speak but whose hands still remember everything they need to say. These languages are real. They are not silence. They are just waiting for the one person willing to sit down, pull the chair close and say, "I'm here." Take all the time you need. Tell me in the comments about someone in your life who speaks a language most people around them have not bothered to learn. Tell me their name if you want to. I read every single one and I would be honored to know them. Hit subscribe if you have not yet. Leave a like so this reaches the person who needs it tonight. And I will see you in the next one.